Hello, my name is Callum Williamson, and the following is a presentation on scenario planning for the gold mining industry. The outline for this presentation is as follows. First, we will introduce the goal of this scenario planning exercise. We will then look at the internal factors that affect the performance of gold mining companies. After that, we will take a step back and look at some of the constant external factors that are present in the industry, also known as givens. The external factors with high degrees of uncertainty, also known as drivers, will then follow. Using these drivers, we will introduce the 2x2 scenario matrix, which produces 4 unique scenarios. These scenarios will then be used to stress test Barrick Gold Corporation's current ESG strategies. Using the insights gained from this exercise, we'll finally end with recommendations for Barrick on how to improve and be better prepared for the future. So what is the goal of this exercise? Scenario planning of this sort is a useful tool for firms to stress test their current mid to long range strategies with a variety of extreme scenarios. After I attended the PDAC conference in March in Toronto, I left with a newfound appreciation for the importance of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG planning. In a world moving towards a green economy, I wanted to ask the question, what strategies can gold miners use to sustainably create value for the next 30 years? Before we get into the external factors that influence success in the gold industry, let's have a look at some internal factors that firms must deal with. One of the main factors miners deal with is ore grade and production. As we've been introduced to in class, there's been a long-standing idea that those with the best rocks win. The share price of mining companies is heavily influenced by announcements about production results or fluctuating ore grades. Another operational factor is costs. Rising costs from things such as G&A can cut into a company's profits. One factor that is more long-term is the growth or replacement of ore reserves being mined. For the gold industry, the growth of reserves is extremely important for creating value. One final factor is worker productivity. Increasing worker productivity is essential for most businesses to create value. Let's now take a step back and look at a few gold industry givens, if you will. These are important external factors that will influence the future performance of gold miners and have a low degree of uncertainty. The first is the idea that all the world's big deposits have been located and depleted. Goldcorp's former CEO, Ian Telfer, suggested in 2018 that big deposits will be a thing of the past. Also, at current reserve estimates, there's only enough gold to maintain production for the next 10 years, at which point production will drop off. One positive about gold is the fact that it dominates exploration budgets. Over half of the metal exploration budgets are dedicated to gold. Finally, mines are taking longer than ever to bring online. There's an average time of 30 years between the discovery of an ore body and bringing it into production. So here, I've plotted some of the external drivers, which have varying degrees of importance and uncertainty. The most important factor I identified was gold price. Often the price of gold has determined the overall success of the industry in years past. On a 30-year scale, it's almost impossible to predict what will happen to this price. I also identified factors such as resource nationalism and environmental pressures, which were then grouped into a factor called geopolitical climate. Resource nationalism has long been a risk for miners. Environmental pressures are somewhat new to the industry, though with the aggressive world climate change goals, they'll surely play a part in the future of the industry. The geopolitical factor is meant to encompass the importance of ESG strategies. One final noteworthy factor is workforce skill and availability. Ernst & Young identified this as one of the main risks to mining, though on a 30-year scale, it's hard to say what will end up happening to the future of work. Ultimately, I decided to use workforce skill and geopolitical climate as my two axes for the scenario matrix. I found that these two issues would create the most interesting scenarios to stress test a company's strategies. Although gold price is highly important and variable, I determined that it would create scenarios that were too simple. The two drivers identified resulted in the scenario matrix seen here. On the vertical axis, the extremes of workforce availability are present. The horizontal axis was created using the idea of the global north and global south. I must point out that these two sides are meant to encompass extreme characteristics of the two socioeconomic definitions, and that they are not based on certain countries or cultures. On the left, the Global South is meant to describe the world in which regions have newly formed democracies with higher levels of economic disparity and more reliance on natural resources and products. On the right, the Global North is meant to describe a world in which regions have developed democracies, less inequality, and have economies based on technologically advanced products. Therefore, their reliance on natural resources is less than the Global South, and they potentially have stronger views on climate change and the green economy. The first scenario is a world in which gold assets are located in developed democratic nations with an abundance of skilled workers. The second scenario is one in which assets are located in developed and prosperous nations, though the competition for human capital is fierce with high employee turnover. The third scenario is one in which assets are located in areas with political volatility, with higher levels of wealth inequality, in which workers are largely unskilled. The fourth and final scenario is one in which assets are located in newly industrialized regions with a large skilled workforce. The company whose strategies will be tested is Barrick Gold Corporation. Barrick is the world's second largest gold miner, with projects located in 13 different countries across the world. Their mission statement is to be the world's most valued gold mining business by finding, developing, and owning the best assets with the best people to deliver sustainable returns for their owners and partners. After reading through their sustainability strategies, I've summarized them into 3 unique points. The first is to support socio-economic development of local communities and host countries transparently and without corruption. In regard to finding the best people, Barrick prioritizes local hiring and targets educated workers right out of school. Their environmental goals are largely related to reducing water use, as well as ensuring safe tailings facilities. For emissions, they're committed to reducing greenhouse gases by at least 10% by 2030. So how does this fit with our scenarios? Scenario 1 has a few interesting implications. First, there may be a negative public opinion concerning the necessity of mining in regions that don't necessarily depend on it for economic prosperity. The abundant workforce will likely demand high salaries that come with the high cost of living in the global north. Finally, there will be mounting environmental pressure from both the public and the governments to ensure commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. Overall, Barrick's social strategy is largely based on improving socio-economic life in the regions they operate in, and does not focus on public perceptions. Their HR strategy fits well here since Barrick prides itself on high-paying jobs. Finally, the environmental strategy will likely be scrutinized by the public for not being aggressive enough on emissions. Scenario 2 is much like the first, though the skilled workforce is now scarce with tremendous competition to find skilled workers. The workers that do get hired will likely be hard to keep. The social and environmental implications are the same as the first scenario, and both of Barrick's chosen strategies do not combat these issues well. Barrick's HR strategy also falls short, since you cannot hire the best people if they do not exist. The third scenario takes place in a world of political volatility, wealth inequality, with an unskilled workforce. Implications include the possibility that mines are not welcomed by locals, and that governments may want to increase taxes on gold profits. There is also a shortage of skilled labor to fill crucial positions. Barrick's strategies fare well in this scenario. The social strategy addresses community concerns, though there are no set public strategy for dealing with governments. The HR strategy is effective for positions that are skilled, though don't require degrees. Therefore, they may have difficulties finding engineers and geologists in this scenario. Finally, their environmental strategy adequately addresses concerns of host communities, which are largely focused on water. The final scenario is one in which assets are located in newly industrialized regions, likely with young democracies and a large skilled workforce. The implications of this may include governments or locals requiring an ownership stake in the project. It also produces the possibility that the workforce shows interest in unionizing, which will increase costs. Barrick's strategy works fairly well socially. They have a robust plan for finding common ground with communities and addressing their concerns. As with the previous scenario, it's hard to say how this strategy addresses resource nationalization. Finally, both the HR and environmental strategies seem to be a good fit, though Barrick's plan to deal with unions is typically aggressive and may result in shutdowns, such as the one seen at Pascagoula. So what are the takeaways? Barrick's social strategy is planned for jurisdictions with characteristics similar to the Global South and is well suited for that future. Their HR strategy assumes that the future workforce will be abundant, which may not be the case. Their environmental strategy may not be aggressive enough to win over the public in Global North-style regions. Given the recent reports that the mining workforce is shrinking and the fact that a major portion of gold comes from nations in South America as well as Africa, Scenario 3 may be the most likely of the four proposed today. Barrick will be well prepared for the social implications of this future, though they will need to prepare for the world in which the workforce is scarce. In closing, I have three recommendations for Barrick. The first is to implement programs that will increase the public's literacy in mining, so they understand that mining is a necessary part of the green economy. The second is to invest in technologies that will minimize workforce size, so their operations will not be as affected by worker shortages. Finally, I recommend that Barrick increase its emissions targets to be in line with the world's 2050 climate goals. This concludes my presentation, and thank you for listening.